All right, so we're here with Bill Hilf again. Thanks for coming on to C9.
You bet.
So last time we talked to you, I think it was about, 6 months ago, maybe a year. And just wanted to touch base with you and see what you've been up to. And I know you're running the CSI team now. Maybe tell us about what you're doing here. And
Yeah, sure. So it was about 6-9 months ago. I still have my Channel 9 guy over there in the corner.
Hey.
Let me bring him out.
Right next to the penguin.
That's
awesome.
right.
See, they can be friends.
They can be friends.
All right.
So, yeah, I'm the general manager of a group that we call Platform Strategy.
Okay.
What that really means is I oversee how we think about open source software, our strategies around open source software, including Linux, how we think about competition, how we think about cooperation, how we participate, and how we think about not only our role in that trend, in that environment, but also how that affects all of Microsoft, from the guy down in the individual country who's in Microsoft sales to developers here in Redmond. So my team has a variety of folks. I have a technical team underneath me, which is what I used to run, and now Sam Ramsey runs that team for me. With our lab, which is down the hall, and a variety of open source experts who work in the lab. I have a team that works with our what we call our field, our sales force. I have a marketing team, I have advertising, PR, and all sorts of stuff on the team. And our goal really is to help change the conversation in the marketplace. And I think a lot of what I spend my time doing, as you know, as we talked last time, this will be my 14th year in open source software. Linux is, I think, 15 years old. So I've been in it as a developer, as a customer building open source software solutions, big environments. I've worked at IBM, now here. So my goal really is to make sure that the marketplace, our customers in particular, understand our position around open source software, the reality of our position, because there's a lot of, in the media, there's a lot of hype and mythologies, and certainly a lot of our competitors, like to encourage that hype and mythology chain. And so I and my team, we spend time helping clarify those things and giving out, the data so people can make unbiased decisions and unemotional decisions.
Sure.
And that's what I do. And I get a great opportunity to understand how people think about commercial and open source software around the world. It's the best part of my job.
Excellent. So that brings up a good question. What is what is your view on open source strategy, and how? Let's be honest. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, open source was quote unquote a cancer. Not to mention any names, but that was sort of the mentality here at Microsoft. That open source is bad, closed source is the way to go, et cetera, et cetera. That's changed over time, and it's changed even further now that you're in this position.
Yeah.
So where are we? What are we thinking?
It's a good point of reference, and I would say the change in what people may be seeing or hearing is largely a reflection of what's changing in the marketplace. And do we have a role in that? I think so, but it's also the industry and what customers are choosing. I was watching another Channel 9 interview with Dave Probert, one of the Windows kernel architects.
Yeah.
And I think it was the 4th episode that you did with him, where he talked about the change in the industry to the 386 processor, and how we didn't really anticipate that change, but customers made that change. And so we had to adapt with the NT project for that processor architecture. And it resonated with me, because in many ways I've seen that happen with the overall software industry, where you have this, 5 years ago there was a large belief system that open source just equals free, or that it was more secure, or more reliable, or gave you freedom, or was just naturally a better thing. And over time, the market has matured and has started to understand open source software and commercial software, and understand the realities of the pros and cons of each. And I think when I visit customers, I spent time today with customers, both this morning, I'll spend time this afternoon, the conversation is not about, I'm going to choose Linux because it's free. Those conversations don't happen anymore. for by a large extent. What really happens is, how do I get this to work together now? I think that what you've seen over those past years is an understanding that Linux is going to be part of the IT environment, and open source is a software trend that's not going away. And so, as a mature software company, we're taking a hard look at that and saying, let's understand very discreetly where we'll compete and where we can find opportunity, a reciprocal opportunity, where we can get value and we can add value at the same time. And I think that's the change that's happened at Microsoft as it relates to the change in the market, as we've seen that transitioning. Will we compete with Red Hat Linux servers with our Windows Server product? Absolutely. And we'll compete with our product, with the development work that we do and the value of our product. Will we compete with databases against free data or open source databases? Absolutely. But on the same time, in the same way that we deal with Oracle today or SAP today or Apple today, we have to have a partnership where we both understand we're going to compete in some areas and we're going to cooperate in others. And that's what I mean by the maturation, is understanding that dynamic. And my job is to understand where those lines are and how we can be effective on both of those things. It's like, in many cases, I use a bad analogy, I think. It's like dating. It really is. And you may have an interest in another individual. You may think they're beautiful, but if there's no interest back, it's a hard process. It's a hard dating process. So as we look at what works, that reciprocity, that return investment on both sides, we look very hard, which is why we do these deals. Some of the deals that I've done with companies like JBoss, an open source Java application server. I think 6-7 years ago, that might have sounded surprising to come out of Microsoft. Open source Java application server. When we looked at that, when I met with the JBoss team and took a harder look at it, half of their customers run on Windows.
Sure.
Although they're not developing in .NET, do we want them to develop in .NET? Absolutely. You want them too.
Yeah.
Channel 9 wants them. Our evangelism organization wants them. But the reality is sometimes they don't. Sometimes they write Java. I wrote a lot of Java before I came here when I was at IBM for different customers. And that's a choice sometimes people make. So we have a pathway. We can say we want to show the value over here of our platform, but we also want to have some sort of opportunity when a choice in that stack may not be a Microsoft choice. So when we talk to JBoss, they're running half of their stuff on Windows Server. The biggest hospital here in Seattle, Swedish Medical, JBoss on Windows. Active Directory, SQL Server on the back end. When I told them that we were doing this deal, they were overjoyed. They said, we thought we were using oil and water together, open source and Microsoft. So debunking that mythology that these can work together and finding ways to work together, which is what our lab does, is really, really important so that people understand the real position and not the mythology. Again, often perpetuated by our competitors. It's very transparent to me how that happened.
Sure.
And making sure that story gets told very clearly.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, good segue into the lab part in the sense. So you mentioned you use the lab to figure out what open source software works with ours, and you test like Windows Server running next to Linux and the interoperation between the two. And in one of our Windows applications, you can actually administer both flavors. But let's let me just ask bluntly, why do we have a Linux lab? Because it certainly isn't because we write software that's going to run on it.
Right.
And and to me that's interesting that we don't do that, because we do write software for the Mac. And I was just wondering, at what point does Linux become important enough of an operating system that we'll write software for it? So that's one question. And the other one is, would you be playing around with that kind of stuff in the lab? So just lab stuff, and then the random question.
Okay. So I'll be a true mathematician with you. You actually asked question 0. So that'll be the first one I use.
Okay.
Which is about the testing in the lab that we do. We actually call the lab here our open source lab, not specifically Linux lab, because we also run a lot of Unix, a lot of different variants of Windows, old versions of Windows. And I think that's about it. We might run a few other esoteric operating systems. We run a lot of flavors of Unix, so AIX, Solaris, HPUX, all the BSDs, NetBSD, FreeBSD, OpenBSD, all sorts of unit Cs. The testing that we do is twofold. One is we test to understand how do we compare. Just take pure competitive level. If we're making a high-performance computing product, we'll do a speed performance race, a Linux high-performance computing system versus the one that we're building, to see how we do. Because that space, high-performance computing, is dominated by Linux. So we want to know how we're doing. And so since we have a bunch of open source software and experts, which are the real value of the lab, the people, we can do that very well. And we can give good analysis to our product teams. We also look for problems early in our product development cycle when it comes to interoperability. This is a big deal, and this is one of the key values of our lab. So when Vista, 2 years ago, was still in development, we had a lot of Vista running in the lab surrounded by non-Microsoft infrastructure. So its DHCP address was given to it by a Linux server. Its proxy and firewalls were, I think they were BSD based. No Microsoft stuff around it. What happens? So it's a dynamic that we try to use as a proving ground for our early phase product to say what breaks. And guess what? We find bugs sometimes that way. We found some really good bugs. Good in the sense that we solved them before it ever got to the customer.
Excellent.
Which is why just recently, I think on Slashdot and a few other places, Sam, who runs my lab, sent an open letter to the Mozilla organization saying, hey, do you want to test Firefox on Vista? We can help out. And that popped up, and people said, wow, why is Microsoft inviting someone like the Mozilla community to their open source labs? It's actually not that, in my mind, I always laugh that even makes news, because we do it every day. We're working on this stuff every day. And the Mozilla community, I believe, we're very interested in that level of help. And why is this important? Because we have people who understand Unix and open source type of systems, Unix, Linux, and open source type of systems. And many people who've worked in my lab over the past couple of years come straight from the open source community. Some people who've created Linux distributions, some well-known names in the security space. And they'll come in here and they work for about a year, and we do a lot of interesting work. So they learn a lot, but they add value then. So when the Mozilla guys come in or someone else comes in, we have open source people here who know how to communicate with them. They know their development process. They know why they can't just walk down the hall and tap on the shoulder of the QA guy, because the QA guy is actually a community distributed across the internet. Understood. So it's understanding and having those bridges being built one at a time. And I got asked a question once at a conference. They said, how do we trust you? It's a good question. How do we trust Microsoft? My answer now is, as it relates to this open source issue, is predictable behavior, consistent over time. Bridge after bridge after bridge. That's nothing to do with open sourcing any Microsoft technology at all, but interoperating well with open source technologies like Firefox is important, because people are using that. JBoss on Windows Server, people are using that. And so we prove a lot of our software early on. Your second question, which is writing software for Linux, so and use the Mac as an example. So there's like multiple different ways to think about this. There's client things, desktop things, or server things. And there's not sort of a magic number where we say, hey, we'll go write software for that platform because it's important. I think fundamentally, we look at our software development investments as we need to invest in what we do best. And we really do Microsoft software best. So when we write management tools, we write them to manage Microsoft products because that's what we do best. We have not classically been a cross-platform development company. And I think we've done some things, like created a Mac business unit specific for that need, but that's really only a one-instance thing that we've ever done in the history of the company for a cross-platform, except for the early days of Windows and NT when they were building for different processor architectures.
Sure.
But what we do instead, and this is really important, what we do instead is say, how do we then interoperate well with other things if we don't build it? So coming from IBM, where there are these product groups like Tivoli, where they'd actually build cross-platform management tools, we say, is there a way to partner with experts? Rather than try to be all things to all platforms, to all people, for all operating systems, are there experts in, let's say, Linux, and build a way for them, their software, to work cleanly with our software, so that we can use our products like the Microsoft System Management Server that can communicate with a Linux system and patch a Linux system. And we did that not by trying to become Linux experts here, which is a fairly big investment, and not what we do best, but find experts who know how to write software for Linux and build over an open standard. In this particular case, it's called Open WebM. It's open standard, so they can communicate back and forth with us. So they do the interesting work, and they also can go make money. There's now a whole company. In this case, it's called Vintella. They got acquired by Quest Software, and there's people every day who get paid now to go write software to do this, and many customers who use that. So our model is be great at Microsoft when we think about these tools, but build them in a way that others can communicate and interoperate and translate back and forth with our technologies. So that's our strategic approach to how we think about cross-platform.
Okay.
And I think it's a very realistic approach. I've worked at other companies where the vision of being cross-platform seems good, but when you actually, having managed a lot of software projects, those are big investments. And largely on not just the coding part, but the long-term support of is where the big investments come. We don't have a division called Microsoft Global Services. We have a services organization, but it's not like IBM, where they actually have 50% of their revenue comes from services and people. So having big support contracts and all of that makes sense for their business, whereas we want to be very effective in writing software. And so partnering with those experts in those other systems has been very effective for us. And it helps foster a bigger software ecosystem too. There's not just one player. I think people are getting tired of that, quite honestly. I think people are getting tired of, I've run a lot of IT shops, and I've been bit more than once by a vendor who wanted to sell me the ultimate management framework that did everything, any platform, anything from satellites to desktops. And I think people are getting tired of these mega framework concepts where you just get it all from one vendor like that. I certainly don't see that with the enterprise customers I talk to. They want things to work together. They want to have the best price, and they want competitors fighting it out to make a best price. And they want to be able to get the best of breed in a given technology solution, not some peanut butter approach to all platforms with a mediocre tool.
Yeah.
And so I got a little jaded there because some of the past things I've been through. You know.
Well, I mean, let's talk about briefly. I mean, what you mentioned, Mozilla, the Firefox people coming here to play around and to write on, to see if they can get it working on Vista. But I guess my question would ask, I mean, is there a certain way that you write open source software that's different? So if I'm a developer and I want to write an application in C++, who cares if I'm open sourcing the code? What is it that I do differently as a developer that because it's open source, I'm not going to design my classes differently? I mean, why wouldn't it work on Windows? Is my question.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So technically, really, there's nothing different. Usually, it's just a bunch of C code that runs on one system versus another. There's two ways I'll answer that. The first is there's a lot of people who write applications for Unix or Linux that are written in a way that are designed for Unix or Linux underneath them. People write applications on top of Windows. Often they know Windows is underneath them. So I'm a very, very old school Unix developer. I started writing C code, server code on Unix systems. I still get confused with concepts like object handles in Windows. That doesn't map to my Unix head. I don't know. Is that a thread? Is it a process? What is that? So there are some architectural differences in how you write code between the two systems. So I see it's common, actually, where I'll see someone's port to Win32 from a Unix app, and it'll be very unreliable, it'll be slow, and when I show it to real Windows developers here, they're like, oh, there's just 5 things these guys could change, and it'll be 10 times more performant. So sometimes I see that, some Unix-style programming that tries to get ported without a lot of knowledge of the Windows architecture as they go through that port. So that's one challenge. It's actually not the challenge that Firefox has, though, because Firefox, what does it run primarily on? Windows.
Yeah.
This is, by the way, the dirty little secret of open source, is most open source actually runs on Windows, and much of it was written to run first on Windows. Nice. So if I were to go through the Apache, MySQL, JBoss, OpenOffice, Firefox, Go down the, of course, Linux excluded to this. They all great first-class citizens, run well on Windows, and have large user bases of Windows. Although a lot of people may not talk about it, besides me, because it's an interesting thing. Tell the listeners, go to SourceForge.net, and you can go through the category of their site listing and look at how many open source projects exist on Windows. It's a large number. It really is.
Excellent.
So there's that dynamic, which is Unix-style programming on Windows. The second dynamic is the process of open source software development is often different than, I would say, typical commercial software development on Windows. And what do I mean by that? There's, in some cases, the people who are doing the coding, it may be a small distributed group of people who aren't full-time on that project. I'm not saying this is necessarily the Mozilla case, but some open source projects I've talked to are like that. There'll be 3 or 4 people who are main committers to the project, but they're only half-time or something. Or they might be gone for the summer for school break or something.
Okay.
So that dynamic happens. The other dynamic that's really important is understanding probably one of the most secret sauces that we have that is glaringly obvious to me now after I've been here, is something that we do that no one else does, is the way that we test. We build Mars rovers and Boeing jets here with the equivalent of when you look at our test matrix. So today on this laptop, this has a Windows logoed little thing here. So that logo means it's fully supported and certified to run XP.
Sure.
There's 90,000 other devices in the world that have that logo. Distinct devices. This is a Fujitsu Lifebook, whatever. And there's 90,000 other PCs and laptops that have that. Then take the matrix and add the number of devices. How many USB sticks, digital cameras, scanners, printers, whatever can plug into that thing. Cards that can slot in. Take that, which is now we're talking millions. Then take the applications, the number of applications that have been written to run on Windows. That matrix, to say we need to have supported configurations across that matrix, is crucial to how we build software. So when we work with in the open source model, I used to work on open source software projects. The testing model is nowhere similar. It's very ad hoc. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it's ad hoc. It's test to the community on what you may have, and there's very little formalized testing at all. Maybe Linux and the OSDL have some processes in place, but for the vast majority of the open source projects, it's very ad hoc. So you do come across situations where you have certain code paths or whatever that may not be illuminated in a testing model. There's no sort of regression analysis or anything of that nature. So what we try to do with some of these projects is say, can we help when we look at application compatibility for Vista? We have tools that try to bubble some of that stuff out so that they feel better about being compatible with our OS. And that's the type of thing that we're trying to do with Mozilla and others, because it's important, right? People may not choose IE, they may choose Firefox, and it should run.
But I mean, people choose products based on feature set, functionality, performance, security, reliability, productivity, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Marketing hyperbole all you want. But the fact of the matter is, for most consumers, if it's open source, it doesn't matter, right? When's the last time you fixed your car? When's the last time you fixed your television set when it went out? I mean, the average consumer doesn't care if it's open source or not. So I guess my question is, why is there such a huge movement? It still exists today, and I know we're sort of loosening up and interoperating, and as opposed to fighting them. But that movement still says, I will not. I mean, there's people, lots of them, and a lot of them are on Slashdot and various other places that are like, if it's not open source, I don't want to use it. Out of principle. I mean, I was down at Maker Faire recently, which is a really cool event, and that's exactly what these people were telling me when I was interviewing them. Some on camera, some off camera, was basically, if I don't know what's in it, I'm not going to drink it. I'm not going to eat it, right? So if I don't know, but the average consumer doesn't understand source code.
Right.
But I would like, so let me just ask you, basically, what's wrong with us open sourcing, say, Office? And what's the Microsoft response to that question of, why don't you open source Office and then just have a license for the source code? What's the problem with that idea?
So you're touching on a very important subject, which is intellectual property, and often, and I'm the pointy end of the spear for Microsoft going into the open source community. I go and talk at Linux World and do keynotes at those events and go to the open source conferences that O'Reilly throws and whatnot. So this question comes up a lot around intellectual property. Our industry, the software industry, is built on intellectual property. The entire thing, not just Microsoft, the entire industry. There would be today no Adobe, no IBM, no Oracle, no SAP, no Siebel, no Microsoft if intellectual property did not exist, because it's the mechanism for how people harvest and protect their innovation. So every day, a bunch of people come to work here and go to Microsoft Research, or they're in a dev team or whatever, and their job is to innovate, is to build great, interesting technologies.
Yeah.
The way that we protect that is through intellectual property. What is intellectual property? This is a good kind of primer on IP. It's patents, which is what people quickly gravitate to. It's copyrights. This is important because this is very relevant to the open source community discussion around copyrights. It's trademarks and trade secrets. Those are the four sort of pillars of intellectual property. And everyone in the industry, certainly IBM. When I was at IBM, I was an active intellectual property participant. Makes money on their intellectual property. That's how people do it. So the manifestation of intellectual property for a software company is source code. And so there's two. Can I whiteboard?
Sure, please.
I'm going to give you the Bill Hilf donut theory.
The Bill Hilf donut theory.
Yeah.
All right.
So this is the theory that there are only two models. There are two models that people use for open source software. There's the vendor model. I'll talk about that one first. And vendor, I mean your classic big vendors: IBM, HP, Oracle, Intel. Go on the list.
Sure.
The classic vendors, as we would call them. And the donut is really simple. And a lot of people get paid a lot of money to make fancier things than these, but it all boils down to this, to this donut theory. You have your core assets, and these are IP. And then you have your complementary assets around here that drive people to use the core. They drive attraction to it.
Okay.
So you can take any of these vendors and put in their core assets. Take IBM. So in here you have WebSphere, you have the Z series mainframe. These are core assets. These are protected by IP. These are things that they sell for a margin and make money.
Okay.
They drive complementary things around here, open source projects often, to draw interest to the core. So why does IBM talk a lot about the open document format? Not because they're particularly interested in the open document format, but because it drives their workplace strategy, which is their new version of the desktop for the future, all powered by WebSphere.
Okay.
So it drives the core. So swap out Oracle. Oracle goes in the middle. Is Oracle open source? No. But they run on Linux, so Linux is a complementary pull-through for them, right? They're interested in that because it helps draw Oracle. Take Intel. Does Intel open source their processors? No, it's a core asset, it's their IP. What do? They try to open source things around to draw attraction to that. They open source their graphics chipset. Any vendor can fit in this donut model. You could take this, and I eradicated about 16 careers with this video because there's strategic open source people at all these companies. This is all it is. Core assets and complementary things that pull to the core. The other model is, I would call the open source business model.
But let me just ask you real quickly with your donut. Why? I mean, clearly we could fit into that model, right?
Yeah, so I'm going to get to that.
Okay, sorry.
But I can't be judicious with my models and not include this, because who didn't I include in that? I didn't include companies like Red Hat.
Yeah.
Which is a significant player in the open source space.
Sure.
What has Red Hat's success been? Because they don't really have a core asset, right? Because it's a community thing. They sell support. So you could say that their support, however that is it's sort of the Red Hat network, is their support mechanism.
Okay.
It's this thing here. I'll show you in a minute. It's this little thing right here, which is the Red Hat network notification tool. This is Red Hat running on my Intel Mac.
Nice.
A weird configuration, but
very cool.
So this is the network that's notification tool that tells me I have new patches.
Okay.
So what do they do around here? They have all sorts of complementary assets around the outside that they use to drive to their core, which is support. So they changed the game a little bit for this model and said support will be our value, but all the software will be for free. They have no actual core IP to monetize. So if you go back to the original donut for all the vendors, and you say, oh, okay, I get it now. And this is, by the way, this isn't just my brainchild. This is from actually working with a lot of customers who eventually realize this because they get bills in the mail from these companies. And they finally realize, okay, Linux isn't free. Open Office isn't free. None of this stuff is free. It's all a drive to do something else. I got to pay Red Hat for support. I got to do something else. Even if I go off the grid and don't use any of this stuff and pay anybody, I'm paying someone to take care of that. I did this as a customer at eToys. I had to pay people to take care of my open source stack. So it was never free. The concept of free is gone. You get free as in cost. We can argue the free as in freedom later, but free as in cost is gone.
Yeah.
So when we look at this, when Microsoft looks at this, we say, what's our core assets? Well, we have an operating system called Windows.
Yep.
And we have Office. And we have a bunch of other things.
SQL.
Server business, all of our server business, all the consumer stuff, everything that we do from our core asset perspective. How do we protect it? Just like all the others. Through IP, it's commercial code, it's binary only. We have certain programs here, like the government security program, that give people access to read-only access for Windows and Office source code for governments, certain things like that. But in general, we're a commercial software model. So what are we doing on the outside? Well, we've been doing stuff on the outside forever, before open source existed. What did we do? We encouraged developers to write to our platform. That's the magic of Microsoft, right? Getting people to develop apps. So with open source, when we look at open source applications out here, again, the dirty little secret that most of these already run on Windows. I challenge people to send me mail to tell me the apps, the open source app, the popular open source apps that don't run at all on Windows. They're hard to find. They really are. There's going to be lots of ones out there, but the popular ones, I would say, all run on Windows. These draw part of our core. So if I have JBoss over here is one example, or MySQL over here is another example. Do I want people to use .NET? Sure. Do I want people to use SQL Server? Sure. But if they don't, I still have a way to draw them to the core, right? They can use Active Directory or Windows, or whatever it may be, but they've chosen to use an open source database.
Sure.
So the change, the big message here is the change is the donut model works for everyone. It really does. And the change in the industry has been, hey, does it matter? Do I care if a developer licenses his software in a binary commercial way over here? This is a commercial developer here. Or if he licenses software with an open source license, do I really care if it's helping my business? No, I like developers. I want developers to write to my platform. If they choose to say, I want this code to be open and free forever, that's fine. That's a developer choice.
Yep.
Which is, to segue slightly to another issue, which is why I personally have, as an open source software developer, I have issues with the GPL because of this. I actually think there's I'm a bigger fan of Apache, Mozilla style, BSD style licenses that give me more control as a developer to do what I want with my code.
Cool.
So that's the donut theory, and it really does simplify how we think about open source and why, to answer your original question about Office on Linux, or you just asked about open source Office.
Exactly.
Why it doesn't matter, because that's not what the open source community is about. It's not. It's about the success of open source to date for anyone has been the ability to find this mixed model of applications and core assets. And I think the great realization that's happening in the industry right now is that IP always matters. It's not that we can argue all day about if you believe in the patent system or not. That's a separate argument. We're talking about IP and invention.
Understood.
That it does matter. And so even people in the open source community who believe in IP but want their source code to be open, they still believe strongly around copyright. And so that's fine. You can choose how you want, but the value system of IP hasn't changed. Now, there's going to be extremists out there. There's going to be some hardcore extremists that think that IP should be completely gone. and there should be no software economy, and that everything should be free, so that you can know everything about everything that you've ever done in your. It's the same model of does that guy who really wants to know everything also want to know everything about what's in his, can of Diet Pepsi?
Yeah.
Every chemical? Probably not. He probably just opens up the Diet Pepsi and drinks it. So there are some customers need that access.
Mm-hmm.
They actually need to modify the SMP algorithm in a kernel. They need to modify the job scheduler in a kernel.
Mm-hmm.
Some customers do. Most don't.
Most do not.
And so our general model is, if I gave you the Windows kernel source code, which I have around here somewhere. Here it is. This is our Windows academic program, where Dave Probert talks about this.
Yeah.
This is the entire Windows kernel source code on this little CD right here. And we're licensed to university so students can learn how to build Windows. Right, so there's a bunch of documentation here, and there's a runtime compiler.
Excellent.
And they can build on Windows. That for a customer though doesn't make a lot of sense. When I talk to customers in, let's say, retail, they don't say, "Gosh, Bill, you know what I really need? So I really need to fiddle around with the process scheduling algorithms that are available to me in the kernel." I've never heard that in 13 years.
Yeah.
So what we deliver is this platform that people, what they want is, they want control of data, they want customization of an app, they want to be able to modify things without breaking the entire stack, and that's what we're trying to enable, both with our commercial software efforts, as well as how we think about open source development. So this here is important for us to sort of clarify with customers.
Mm-hmm.
We're not competing against the open source community at all. Are we competing with commercial products that come out of that? Absolutely, we do. That compete with our products, Red Hat servers, databases. We're going to compete with those. Are we going to compete with Firefox? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But we're also going to invite them here to work to make sure that they can run on Windows, because that core asset, the Windows operating system, is important for Firefox users.
Absolutely.
And that's the distinction. It's not a community competition thing at all.
Mm-hmm.
It's about understanding how we coexist and understanding where we compete and making sure people know where those lines are.
Excellent. Well, that's answers that question.
Yeah,
very cool.
I have to do the donut theory.
Well, the donut theory is good.
I did a similar thing when I was at IBM. So I showing how people think about this is important, because it also takes some of the veneer off of the marketing BS that you hear a lot from vendors.
Yeah.
These vendors aren't in open source for community love and for freedom, and there's no interest there. They're all commercial entities.
Mm-hmm.
They're all commercial businesses at the end of the day. They're finding ways to drive access to their core assets. And yeah.
So I was just going to say, because you mentioned that free isn't free. Is it Stallman? Or who's the
Richard Stallman is the sort of the father of the GPL and the Free Software Foundation,
mm-hmm.
And the concept of software freedom.
Sure. So why does software? Why would it have to be open source to be free?
It doesn't.
So I mean, that's sort of a strange. I just see this interesting political. When we talked about it, you did mention briefly about open source for the sake of open source, and open source where it makes sense. So I want to ask you a question. And you sort of alluded to it, but just to be clear, where does open source make the most sense, in your opinion? If I were going to write an application, I had to choose: do I want to open source it, or do I want to keep it closed? Either way, I'm going to make money because I want to sell it. So is there a difference between, if I decide to be open source, how much money I can make?
I think that's a real question.
Okay.
So depending on what you do sort of drives the business model that you would create to make money. So if you decide that your software will be pure GPL, and which means that it stays open source forever and there can't be any IP generated around it, etc. If that's your model, then you have to find sort of a Red Hat model, which is, okay, well then I'll go monetize through services or support or some other thing like that versus selling software. To date, again, this month actually is the 15th, I believe it's this month, is the 15th anniversary of Linux. So by the way, the NT kernel is about 15 years old too. So there's no newness with Linux. And people still think, oh, it's a new thing. No, it's not. It's about. I don't hear a lot of people saying NT is new.
Yeah, exactly.
So to date, the only company in my mind that has found success, revenue success with that model is Red Hat. There's been lots of other players that have been around for a long time. No one's actually found success. They were a first mover in it. So I don't know if I would use that as the investment criteria if I were a venture capitalist looking at a software developer, saying, oh yeah, you're going to give away software in GPL and then you're going to sell services. If that's the business model, I think today in 2006 in the venture capital community, I don't think that's enough. I don't think it flies. So what do some people do? What do the new generation open source people do? And I commiserate with a lot of these folks. They find ways to do mixed models or hybrid models, where they'll say there's going to be part here that we want to keep in the community. We'll find a license that allows us to keep it in the community. And there's going to be part over here that's going to be our enterprise offering, our high-end value add, whatever it is. Plug into the mainframe or something that we'll charge for. And they find a way to have a little bit of both. They want some to be in the community and some over here. And so a good example of that is Sugar CRM. They're an open source CRM software company, and John Roberts and his team is CEO of Sugar CRM, and I think he's very, very progressive in his thinking about open source business models, because he has identified a way to keep code in the community and a way to keep code that, well, it's like a 70-30 split. They keep code for their, he wouldn't call it this, but their proprietary offering, their commercial offering, where they're going to find ways to generate money that helps pay the developers and sustains the whole cycle of what they're trying to do. The interesting thing about Sugar CRM is I did a deal with them. We announced a partnership with them, technical collaboration with them, and they are releasing their version for Windows underneath one of our shared source licenses. So they're taking one of our shared source licenses, and why? Not because he's a nice guy, but he's not a big fan of Microsoft, other than he likes that his customers choose it. He's choosing it because our shared source licenses, which I think are very, very good, we have 3 community licenses, is very simple. There's very little legalese in it, and it's 1 page long.
Wait, and we offered these licenses?
So let me explain how we did this. So we have lots of licenses, and we have lots of licensing attorneys here at Microsoft. Some of the best in the business, quite honestly. And a while back, I think it was about a year ago, there's a group of us who work on shared source here, and a couple of our very progressive licensing guys, we said, hey, there's kind of the charter is, I'm a developer, write me a license that I can understand that without having to go get a law degree or hire a lawyer, that is a 1 page long, simple English, and makes sense for me and gives me what I want. And so one of those licenses, what we call the MSCL, the Microsoft Community License, it's Microsoft.com, WAC shared source, you can get to it, is very, very enabling for a developer to say, yeah, I want to put this code in the community on a file-by-file basis. I want to put this code in the community, I want to put this code over here and keep it mine and make money from that. And so Sugar CRM really liked that. And so they said, hey, can we use your license? I didn't solicit them or anything. They said, can we use your license? And I said, sure, absolutely. And so they're going to release their next version of Sugar CRM for Windows underneath that license.
Sweet.
So I do think there's a change in behavior. I think people are getting smarter about open source licensing, because that is the control mechanism. What makes it open source is not the source, it's the license. So that requires people to be smart about what licenses they choose, the developers to be smart. So I would encourage people to really think a lot about their software and how they want to license it. If it's going to be an open source model, use something that's going to give you more power as a developer to choose what you want to do.
Excellent. And I like the differentiation between the platform and the soil, as it were, to write your applications on. Open source, closed source, doesn't matter. You have a revenue model, that's your business. People want to be able to read your source code, that's great. We're going to provide a platform for you to do whatever the hell you want. And that should have been the Microsoft stance all along. I'm glad to see that that's now the case. we're not going to open up Windows to make it easier for you to write open source software on Windows, but we will provide a place for you to be able to write open source software on Windows. So that kind of leads to what you guys are doing with Firefox. You're working with them to show them, to help them through any problems they may have. Now, do you see, as a result of this, you'll be able to write maybe white papers or build tools to help out other guys?
Yeah, it's good. It's a good question. So the one thing I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to write this white paper if nobody else does, is I do see. So we look for patterns. We look for patterns of, gosh, it seems like some of these developers keep making the same mistakes again and again. And so we're trying to capture those patterns of, like this, the goofy example I gave earlier of, what is an object handle? And Unix guys struggle with that. Maybe I'm just stupid, but a lot of guys I talk to struggle with it. And so they're often looking for guides and best practices and things like that. Some already exist. Jason Zions is a former Unix guy who's been at Microsoft for a while, was very involved with our Unix subsystem inside Windows Server. And he's written some very good guides on this. But we're going to try to capture the open source developer patterns that we see when they're thinking about writing apps on Windows. Also, what we've done is there's two key things I want to make sure I mention. One is a new website called Port25.
Yeah.
It's port25.technet.com. Absolutely an idea that I stole from you guys with Channel 9.
We've even used an integer, so
yeah, that's right.
Nice.
Channel 9's been just a great success, and I'm proud to work at a company that did Channel 9. So we took that model and said, can we do something similar, very specifically for the open source audience? So today we get a lot of traffic on Port25.
Good.
I blog there, my guys blog there, and what's interesting is about 3/4 of our traffic comes from non-Microsoft platforms. Most people visit us from Firefox or Safari or non-Windows platforms.
Excellent.
Which is the audience we want to talk to. So they can understand what we're doing in the lab, they can talk to us, they can comment to us, whatever it may be. And then the other thing that we're doing is called CodePlex, which is codeplex.com, a forum for community development where you can choose any license you want and put any piece of software. There's a lot of open source related software that's being done on Windows. There's some really interesting stuff, and people should look at it just to dig around what people are putting up there. I get surprised by some of the projects that are up there. I think there's, no joke, I think there's like 6 open source CRM projects up there now, and Sugar CRM isn't even up there yet, although they're working on getting up there.
Wow.
And there's just a lot of activity, and it shows you that there's a community here, again, that dirty little secret, that this isn't oil and water, that it's just as great of a platform to develop on as Linux or Unix or whatever or else may be. And then if you match the opportunity, which is what I tell developers who actually want to make money at some point in their life, you match the opportunity on server and desktop of where we're growing. Our numbers are huge. We have more Windows servers in the market than anybody else, than Linux and Unix and anybody. So if you're looking at an opportunity, again, however you want to write your app, open source, commercial, however you want to do it, if you want a base to build on, we got the platform for it, and we have the right environment for you to do it on. And so we have plugins for Visual Studio for writing apps to talk to MySQL. They're part of the VSIP program now. We've done stuff with, I've mentioned JBoss and Sugar CRM. We've done lots of other players in the open source space. We'll be doing more. You'll hear more announcements from us over the next few months around some of these new deals that we're doing. And it's not that different. I don't want to take credit of being the big thinker here. This is exactly what we do at Microsoft with developers. We want people to develop to our platform, make it available to people. That's what we'll do with Live. We want people to use our Live services. And if we, again, dating, if we give value to you as a developer and you find your ways, if it's a reciprocal thing, it all works out very well. It really does. We're not doing this for any nefarious reasons. We're doing it because it's good for us and it's good for the developers.
Fantastic. It would be nice to see some tools coming out that would run on Linux, but we'll leave that for maybe another discussion. Well, you mentioned it would be nice if I was a developer, and I was, if I could, one of the great things we produce as a company are developer tools.
Yeah.
Fantastic stuff. It would be great if we'd do that for more than just one platform. obviously we want people to write on Windows. I want people to buy Windows.
Yeah.
I want people to use .NET, but it would be nice to abstract away the platform from a development environment.
Yeah, it's a good question, but I'm a numbers guy, and I'm very, very, I mean, to the date, I know the latest numbers of where things stand.
Mm-hmm.
There is no market right now for us to target. You know how we're a volume market software company.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be a market base for us to make the investment to go build. The Mac business unit we built because there was a market base for us.
Sure.
And you're talking about Linux desktops now. You're not talking about the server. And the Linux, you are right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Linux desktop market, although there's people using it, there are people using Linux desktops. It's not in a worldwide base of the environment.
Mm-hmm.
It's not substantial enough to say, gosh, there's millions of people who really need a tool to run on Linux desktops. It's very relegated to technical workstations for a small set of people.
Mm-hmm.
Could that change? Could we change? Sure it could change. And do we have conversations like that here? Often, we do. But we make decisions based on business opportunity. Of what is the opportunity for Microsoft if we're not going to make a big investment and lose money on it for the next 10 years just because a few people blog about the fact that they want Office on Linux.
Mm-hmm.
No customer, by the way, has ever asked me for that. People like it because they think it's going to be an agitating question for me.
Sure.
At this point, none of them agitate. They ask it, but very rarely, are they truly interested in rolling out thousands of desktops running Office on Linux.
Mm-hmm.
Let alone all the other reasons why it doesn't make sense. So we always look through the lens of, although there might be one or two loud voices that say, there's going to be Office on Linux one day, I promise you. That's great. We don't make business decisions on press or headlines. We make it on real data and real customers. So I always make sure that every day, the reality check for me is, what are customers asking me to do for anything?
Mm-hmm.
What are they asking me to do? The press is huge and loud and noisy, and it's always going to be there. But if customers come to me and say, here's what I really want, here's what we really need, and we see that in volume, and who knows, we may one day.
That would be, just to go back to the Office on Linux, big deal. Office, we do it for the Mac, right? It's a very different architecture than our platform. So as you were saying, if you have the numbers, we'll make some money off of the Linux community and sell them Office. Good business decision, in my opinion, if the numbers are there.
If numbers are there.
I hear you. They're not asking for an open source version of Linux, of Office. Mm-hmm. Because that, I guess, wouldn't be very, what's the business model behind that? We talked about that. That was my initial question that got you to do the donut model. But this is great. I'm trying to think of any other questions that the Niner type OSS people would want me to ask you, and I think we've covered pretty much everything.
There you go.
Haven't we?
I think. If nothing else, I like doing this because I like making sure people get our position clearly.
Yeah. So that's it. So that's really excellent that you said that, because there was a question lost in the back of my mind that just came up. I was reading this on Channel 9. Somebody posted a thread about, an Indian state dumping Microsoft technology for open source. And there's always these cases where some government agency or something like that, or some institution dumps Microsoft technology for open source. And to me, I just don't quite understand, again, why that decision has to be made. So what do you think of it? Think about when you read something like, X country decides to run everything on open source and get rid of Microsoft.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd reiterate one truism, which is you have to be careful what you make decisions on from what you read in the press. Remember, press headlines are often designed, and stories are designed for eyeballs, to grab eyeballs. So the more conflict and drama and color in a headline or a story, the more readership, the more ads they sell on their website. Real simple economics. So stories are crafted, not to say there's some PR puppet master here, but as many of those stories as I hear either through individuals or through other channels, the opposite stories. Sometimes in many orders of magnitude greater than what I see in the press. So I take a very, very pragmatic view of what I read in the press, and then what I know is happening in the industry. And then, of course, I weigh that against third-party data that we get from analysts and third-party sources. I think your point, though, is really spot on, which is people try to polarize right away to say it's got to be Microsoft or open source. And what I find really interesting is Brazil is a good example. I spend a fair amount of time in Brazil. And Brazil will often, in the press, will say, oh, Brazil is anti-Microsoft, pure open source. So there's a group, an IT group, that is funded by the Brazilian government that said, let's go and actually count how much money we spend, software costs, for the government. And they came back, and on the list, and with all the headlines, you would assume we'd be number one because they want to get off the Microsoft train. We're number 12 on the list in terms of money spent by Brazil, the government of Brazil, for software. IBM is way up there, Oracle, SAP. So the point I was trying to make, I blogged about this, is the reason why is we're a poster child is because of this. This is what people see every day when they go in to work. They see Windows. They don't see SAP. They don't see IBM mainframes. They don't see Oracle databases. They see it and they associate this with commercial software. And so we do play a poster child in that. So I think that's where you get, in many cases, very myopic thinking around, I have to choose one or the other. Where I see very, I would say, progressive or at least common sense thinking is when people say, how does this make a difference to my country, state, local government, whatever it is? And am I making a commercial software decision? Am I making an open source software decision? And if I'm making that, what behavior do I want to incent in my country or state or whatever it may be? What often I find is those government agencies typically end up in the same spot after time. So the city of Munich, and just as many city of Munich things there are, there's other cities that evaluated Linux desktops and decided to go all Windows. But where they often end up after time is realizing that what they all want is they want control. They want to control their data, usually. Mm-hmm. They want data control, which is why we have this OpenXML document format capability, why we have an open document format, an ODF plugin for Office. That's an open source project for Office 2007. So if people want to save to a different format, they can now, or read from it. So that's the net requirement, that where they all end up. We want control. When it's not a pricing thing, because you're not going to save money choosing an open source desktop versus a Microsoft desktop. It just never plays out that way, because the money puck moves. It moves to different spots, people cost versus acquisition cost. But that control point is important. And so I do think I get a bit of a Groundhog's Day scenario when I travel around the world. I'll go to some countries where I won't name the countries, but sometimes I'll go to a country and I'm like, wow, this is exactly looks like the U.S. 5 years ago. I'll go to another country and go, wow, looks like France 2.5 years ago. Same issues, same words coming out of the mouth. So sometimes, like when I'm doing a back-to-back trip, I'll just go, it's like Groundhog's Day. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes you say, gosh, I wish you could just see what these guys did and learned. And it doesn't mean they always went Microsoft. Sometimes they decided a hybrid model. Sometimes they went, a mix of open source on Windows or other technologies, delivering web-based things to any desktop. But I just wish that they were able to see that in a broader way. And that's one of the benefits and banes of my job is to go through that Groundhog's Day scenario. I feel like Bill Murray often, waking up like, wow, here we go again. And I think in the government level, because they grab a lot of headlines, I think I would just encourage people to be pragmatic about believing everything they read and understanding there's probably a lot more data underneath that.
Fantastic. Well, all right, I've taken up a lot of your time. I know you have to go talk to customers.
Yes, I do.
But we'll see you again, maybe in another 9 months or so. See where you are this time.
You bet, man.
Working on.
I love talking Channel 9.
Great. Nice
Thanks,
chatting
bud.
with you, man.